Hey everybody, I'm JT, and thank you for joining me on Run and Gun again this week. Do you guys love depth of field, that smooth, shallow, out of focus background as much as I do? Well, if you do, then this is the episode for you. Stick around because we're gonna talk about the 3 factors that decide how shallow or deep your depth of field is. So whether you're shooting on a mirrorless, a DSLR, whatever lens, whatever camera, your iPhone, video camera, I'm gonna give you the tips, the tricks to make that creamy, cinematic, awesome depth of field in your shot. So let's get right into it. All right, so let's start taking photos. So we have our little scene set up here. We have a background. We have our D5 with our 14mm prime. We're gonna be shooting this at f4 and a 50th of a second. So let's take our first test shot. So we're focused right here on the front of the camera, and that's some pretty deep depth of field. The cameras are in focus, the background's in focus. That's not really what we're looking for. That's not that nice shallow depth of field that we want. And one of the main reasons is because of our focal length. We're shooting at 14mm. And that's the first thing to look for when you want super shallow depth of field is your focal length. So your focal length is measured in millimeters, 14mm, 50mm, 70 to 200mm. That's the focal length of your lens. And the larger the number, the farther zoomed into your scene you are, and that's gonna give you that super shallow depth of field. We're gonna move on to a 50mm lens from this 14 and see what that looks like. All right, so we have our 50mm lens on right now. I moved our little scene back a little bit, and I moved the actual camera back a little bit, just so we can have that general same kind of perspective to our scene and getting the same kind of crop to it. So let's take a picture with our 50. We're gonna focus right on the front, and let's see what our depth of field looks like. All right, so we're starting to see that depth of field. We left all of our settings the same, still at f4, still 1/50th of a second. All we changed was our focal length, that we're now shooting at 50mm. We are zoomed into our scene, and as you can see, just the tip of this lens here is getting a little bit blurry, and the whole background behind our camera setup is getting nice and blurry, and we're starting to get that cinematic depth of field. So let's move on to an 80mm lens and see what that looks like. All right, so now we have an 85mm prime on our camera. We have our same setup. I extended the distance just a little bit, so again, we can get that same kind of perspective on the shot. So let's take our test shot with our 85mm prime. And we're still at f4, still a 50th of a second. We're really starting to get that super creamy, shallow bokeh in the background. It's all starting to kind of blend together. The colors, the texture is just disappearing and blending into one smooth background. That is the super shallow depth of field we're looking for. And again, all we changed was our focal length. So let's look at some other things we can change. Let's throw our 50mm lens back on for the rest of this video and see what we can come up with. All right, so we have our 50mm prime back on our camera, our nifty 50, and we have our scene kind of set up the same way it was. We were shooting at f4. Let's bump it down to, let's say f1.8, maybe f2. So let's bump it down a little bit. We're going to, let's see, let's go to 1.8. And to make up for that extra light that we're now letting in because we opened up our aperture, we're gonna have to move our shutter up a little bit. Let's say about 1/60th, maybe 1/25th of a second. Let's test this shot real quick. That's looking pretty good. Our exposure is the same. That is some razor thin depth of field we're getting right there. Only our shutter button right here is in focus. A little bit of this cap right here. Everything else is blurring out. The whole background, super nice and blurry. That gorgeous depth of field. The front of the lens, completely gone, just lost in blur. That amazing bokeh. And as you saw, we opened up our aperture, and your aperture is the second factor that controls your depth of field. So the wider you have your aperture, let's say f2, f1.4, f1.2 if you have the option, you can see you start getting that super shallow cinematic depth of field. But you do have to be careful. You have to compensate with your shutter or your ISO, or you can shoot in aperture priority mode and just shoot at 1.4 and let the camera decide what you want to do. So just be careful. Again, make sure that you're getting your actual subject in focus, because when you get that razor thin depth of field, it starts to become a challenge. But I want even shallower depth of field, and I want an even blurrier background. So what am I going to do? I'm actually going to take my camera and I'm going to move it forward towards my subject. And that is our third factor that's going to decide how shallow our depth of field is. That is your distance between your camera and your subject. So let's take another photo. That is some shallow depth of field. I think we're working with a focus plane that maybe barely a ½ inch. Super shallow, super creamy, amazing, soft, shallow depth of field. I love it. So as you can see, the closer we move to our subject, the more shallow depth of field we have. The background just completely gone, disappears. If you have anything distracting your background, it's just gonna melt away into nothing, and you're gonna have that epic, awesome, shallow depth of field. Now this also applies if you were using that 14mm lens. So let's actually bring that 14mm prime lens back. Alright, so I told you you could get super shallow depth of field with like any lens, right? We can do that with our 14mm lens too. We just have to play with those other settings. So we had 3 factors. We had our focal length, we had our distance between our camera and our subject, and we also had our aperture. So let's change our aperture. Let's open it up all the way to 2.8, and we're going to be shooting at about a 60th of a second. And when we move our camera extremely close to our subject and we have our subject far away from the background is still going to have some fairly nice depth of field even for that 14mm. So let's take a little test shot. Wow, for 14mm, that's still a fairly blurry background. You're still kind of eliminating some of those distractions you may have in your background. If you have a gray background or a backdrop like this, that is perfect. You're going to lose all the texture and it's going to be a nice gray backdrop. But that is how you can get super shallow depth of field. Even if you're working with a 14mm lens, you still have the option to open up your aperture all the way, and you can get close to your subject and make sure your subject is nice and far from that background to get that super awesome depth of field. So I hope you guys liked this episode. I hope you learned something. Make sure you subscribe down below and hit that notification button so you're getting all my new videos every weekend when I drop them. I will see you guys next week, and until next time, get out and go shoot.